the land acknowledgement. JCFS is located on Treaty 1 lands, the homeland of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, and Dene peoples, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. JCFS respects and acknowledges the harms and mistakes, and we dedicate ourselves to collaborate in partnership with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. For those who may be wondering, what is Rosh Chodesh? We get this question quite a bit. In Hebrew, the new moon is referred to as Rosh Chodesh, which begins a new month on the biblical calendar, marked by the appearance of the new moon. Though Jews traditionally observe this day, it is celebrated as a holiday for women, whose origins go back to the Talmud. In Judaism, this holiday symbolizes renewal and restoration. Over the past 3 decades, Rosh Chodesh observance has been reviewed by Jewish feminists. The book Miriam's Well, Rituals for Jewish Women Around the Year by Penina Delman presented the experiences of one of the first women's Rosh Chodesh groups and rituals, focusing on spiritual growth and connect together to celebrate this holiday. And that is what we're here to do today. Before we begin, I would like to extend our gratitude to the Jewish Foundation for providing funding and making this possible. I would like to thank the Rosh Chodesh Committee, who worked hard to put this together as well: Alexis, Cheryl, Nira, Adina, Brooke, and Randy. But last but not least, I would like to thank and welcome Rabbi Denise, who will be our primary speaker today, discussing our topic, the modern Jewish woman. Who is she? So Denise Handlarski is a rabbi of secularsynagogue.com, an online community for Jews who just want to hang out with Jews. She is also an educator, an officiant, community leader, a labor and birth doula. We have had the pleasure of working with Rabbi Denise in the past in previous Rosh Chodesh workshop. She brings energy and warmth, offering enthusiasm, compassion, and positivity. With that being said, I will let Denise take it away. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So nice to be back with your community. I hope everybody is well. And we're going to dive right in. Yeah, the question of modern Jewish women, I don't know. I was like, we're just going to do a little bit of a tour of Jewish women, Jewish feminism, because, of course, the answer to who is the modern Jewish woman is as varied as we have, Jewish women. And so I thought, what would be a good use of our time this evening would be to think through how Jewish tradition has viewed women, or the figure of the woman, how Jewish feminists have worked with that, and sometimes rejecting certain expectations, sometimes embracing them or changing them. And then I'm going to take you through a couple of practical examples too. But I like to start with a story. So I'll tell you the story of how I became a Jewish feminist. And maybe some of it will resonate with some of you. So I was quite young. I was really interested in Judaism. My parents sent me to a Chabad Lubavitch, so like very Orthodox summer camp, when I was about 7 years old. And I remember being like, all the women have to wear these long skirts and dresses. And then they sort of talked to us about covering their hair, but also about how they would gather together and bake challah for Shabbat. And so I was like, being a woman in Judaism is kind of unique. And I feel like I'm so privileged to have had that experience, because up until that point, I was really kind of raised in a feminist way without thinking through the differences in gender so much. So I was 7 and I wasn't really aware of gender differences, not consciously really. And then I was like, oh, it's kind of nice that like it's different to be a woman if you're Jewish, if you're, an observant Jew. And then that really got turned on its head with a couple of experiences I had later. One was that when I was about 14, I went with the Chabad. I was never at Lubavitch, but I hung out with them. And I went with them on a trip led by a Chabad Lubavitch Rebbitzin, so the rabbi's wife, and clergy team from a synagogue in my community. And they took us to Crown Heights, New York. I'm going to be very honest with you. The main attraction for me to participate in this was a free trip to New York. So I was, interested in the Jewish parts, but mostly I was like, oh, we have to go to New York. That's fun. And again, there were things I found very charming about it. We stayed with local families. We got to visit, the big Rebbe's temple, and it was just after the Schneerson Rebbe died, and people were still really grieving. It was very interesting. But also on that trip, I saw that in that big temple, that world famous temple, the women's section was very small. And so although it's a very large prayer space, the men have the whole downstairs. At least it was like this in the 90s, which is the last time I was there. The men have the whole prayer space and women are upstairs. It was very, very small. And women took turns kind of gazing out like a little window to be able to see what was going on. Why? Because women would be distraction to the men in their prayer. And so I had one of those like, wait a minute kind of moments. And I've taught lots of gender studies. I teach at a university. And I remember teaching gender studies, one of my colleagues would say, she feels like a lot of feminist awakening moments are wait a minute moments. So you're like, well, that's not quite right. So I had that. And also they took us to the mikveh, the Jewish ritual bath, to show us what it looks like and to explain the ritual. We didn't actually immerse in the bath, but it was a learning experience. And they spoke about how because women are unclean after menstruation, they have to purify themselves. And I was like, no, it's not for me. Now, I don't want to be disrespectful to the tradition in the culture. I want to be in conversation with it. But for me, as a very young feminist, those were red lines. I was very happy to participate in Jewish life, but I sought community where women could participate equally, could be leaders, and that has been the trajectory of a lot of Jewish feminists. So we're going to look at some of that stuff. I'm going to be in screen share for a lot of this. I won't be able to see the chat very well in screen share, so if there's a question or something, we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion at the end. But if you want me to clarify, or if for some reason the tech isn't working or you can't hear me, just please unmute and tell me, so I don't spend a long time doing something that is inaccessible. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to bounce around a little bit. Hopefully you can see this Safaria link. Great. And it's a question. I didn't create this sheet. It was created by Rebecca Klemner. And it says, should I try being Eshes Chayil or Eshet Chayil? So we're going to look at what it is. And this is the original biblical textual reference. Essentially, the translation is woman of valor. And in Proverbs 31, it says, many women have done well, but you surpass them all. Okay. So this is kind of a little bit of our Tanakh text, our biblical text, and then lots and lots of discussion about what it means to be the kind of woman who surpasses all other women. Okay, I'm going to have a lot to say about it, but one thing to say is I don't love, from a feminist perspective, how immediately what it means is that women are in competition with each other for like, who's the bestest of the women? Who's the most woman of valor of all the women of valor? I think that already shows that we're working in a patriarchal tradition, which we are, right? Judaism, like many religions, is a patriarchal religion. So it shouldn't be surprising when it shows up in our text. Okay. And then Midrash, Abraham was old and well stricken in years, so referring to Genesis 24. And scripture states, also in reference to this verse, a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. This verse alludes to Abraham who mourned for Sarah, for it was written previously, and Sarah died. Abraham began to weep for her, saying, a woman of valor who can find? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her. So you might know there's a movie called A Price Above Rubies. There's lots done with this kind of thinking. I wanted to pull This is a book of the lives of great biblical women based on rabbinic and mystical sources, and it's called The Crown of Creation. So it takes from this the idea of a crown to her husband. Well, maybe not all of us, maybe that's not our main objective, but the crown of creation. And it takes, this is by Hannah Weisberg, it takes biblical and rabbinic stories and centers the women and sometimes gives perspectives of women characters that we don't get in the original sources. So that's an example of what feminist writers and scholars have done with our tradition. Look for the silences and take something like the idea of a woman of valor and think about what we can do with it that might feel useful to us in a very different kind of frame. I think there was one more thing I wanted to say about the women of valor. Oh, yes. And then it talks about 19, so the Eshet Hayil, the women of valor, corresponds to 19 great Jewish women with offerings we're supposed to learn from each, including Naama, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, Rachel, etc. So we have these examples from our textual tradition of what it means to be a woman. And then we're supposed to, as those of us who identify as women, extrapolate from that and be like, okay, so I can take those qualities and try to emulate those, and that would make me a woman of valor, the crown of my husband's whatever, and so, and that's supposed to be our aspiration. I just shared in the chat the link to that Sefaria page if you want to explore it further on your own, because I don't want to dwell there too long. But just to say, a lot of the discussion of what it means to be a Jewish woman comes from these original biblical texts. And yet, what we will see is that the history of women in Judaism is a history of resistance. And so that is what the tradition has said. But I like to imagine that there have always been women who have played with it or rejected it or made it their own in some way, just the way that Hannah Weisberg does in a more contemporary frame. But certainly there have been, queer women who have lived outside the boundaries and structures or multiple. There's lots and lots of wonderful, I'm just looking for another book I wanted to show you, lots and lots of wonderful stories of women who did all kinds of heroic and remarkable things. And another thing to say is that because so often the expectations were very gendered, so men, I'm going to say men and women a lot, because that's the way, for the most part, Jewish tradition has understood gender roles. I want to acknowledge that there are many ways to live a gendered experience, but typically in Judaism, there were roles for men and there were roles for women, and even if some of our sources talk about non-binary or trans people, the roles were not set up that way historically. You know what I'm saying? So historically, we've had kind of men's roles and women's roles. Men were to study, they spent a lot of time in the Beit Midrash, and for a long time in many traditions, women were not part of the Beit Midrash, not taught to read Hebrew, the language of prayer and study. So they were kind of excluded, but that doesn't mean there weren't Jewish practices. So another thing I like to point to is the Yiddish Tahinas, which are Jewish women's prayers that Ashkenazi women wrote in Yiddish because they were sort of excluded from the main prayer tradition. They were expected, of course, to, pray, to go to synagogue, etc., but they weren't expected to study the same way. And the other really cool thing about this, especially from the perspective of someone like me who became a Jewish doula, is they have prayers that center on the experiences of women. So for example, this is the translation, but a pregnant woman's prayer. So there was nothing like this in the mainstream prayer tradition, right? And I'll just read a bit of the example. It says, I pray unto you, Lord God of Israel, that you consider my prayer as you did mother of Hannah, the prophetess who prayed for a son, the prophet Shmuel. May her merit stand me in good stead. May I, your maidservant, who am with child, your creation. So with an exclamation point, you did this, God, we're in this together, carry full term and give birth to a healthy child who will become a pious Jew and serve your heart and soul, one who will love Torah and be God-fearing according to your holy will, a beautiful plant in the Jewish vineyard for the beauty of Israel. So interesting that they created these blessings largely out of a history of exclusion, where they were not welcome in the Beit Midrash, the house of study, and so they created their own prayers and blessings modeled after them. And also you see these are educated Jewish women because they're referring to the story of Hannah and Samuel from the book of Samuel, where she prays to have a child. And so they know the textual tradition and they create their own blessings and prayers out of them based on their own lived experience and their own needs. So I love those kinds of examples of what I see as a little bit of a, very pious and in the tradition, but a somewhat a resistance to the tradition that women have created as well. Okay. And then I'm just thinking about where I'm going to go next. There is so much to say. I'm just going to keep going on my book tour, if I may. Then we have second wave feminism is really the dawn of Jewish feminism as we kind of understand it in a modern frame. Like I'm saying, I would consider these acts of creating Yiddish women's prayers feminist acts, but they wouldn't have called themselves feminists. But around the 70s, you start getting Jewish feminists calling themselves Jewish feminists and wanting to challenge and change the tradition according to their feminist lens. And one of the more famous examples of this is the book Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective by Judith Plaskow. So this was fairly canonical for second wave feminism. And I just, this was one of the early Jewish feminist books that I read that I found, and this is the idea she takes from the idea we talk about at Shavuot, that all Jews through all time, all the souls gathered in Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, born Jews, Jews by choice, Jews at that time and through all of the many generations after received the Torah at once. So she names her book Standing Again at Sinai to say, we need a new revelation, right? I was supposed to have been there, but I don't get treated as though I was there. As a woman, I'm excluded from a lot of what makes Jewish life meaningful, and that's not right. And how do we fix it? So, just so many beautiful lines from this for sure. In it, she also talks about changing liturgy. So if you're not muted, I would just love if you could mute because I can't see who's unmuted, or maybe one of the admin team can help with that, just because I'm hearing a bit of an echo. So she talks about changing the liturgical tradition and changing blessings and prayers also. So the reason I'm pointing so many examples is that was often the way Jewish feminists started, was to say, we have to say Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. We have to talk about the God we pray to only in the masculine. What if we reimagined liturgy and thought about a feminine expression of God, or brought more of women's experiences into liturgy? So she has an example: let us acknowledge the source of life for the earth and for nourishment, maybe conserve the earth that it may sustain us, and let us seek sustenance for all who inhabit the world. So without, I want to avoid stereotyping, but a lot of the women's blessings that they created were much more earth-centered, were much more about caretaking and being in community with Jews, but also the larger human family. So kind of reflecting a different ethos and ethic than some of the more masculine prayers as well. And then she speaks about the emerging God of feminist spirituality. So how can we reimagine God in a feminist image? A lot of that work was done by those kind of second wave feminists. And then there's lots to say about the history of women in Jewish life. So this is just the homepage of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm going to pop that in the chat as well for you to explore. There's so much here. There's a podcast. There's amazing their collection that you can look at. I wanted to note the Women of Valor section, so the original source text for it now. And they're thinking about Emma Goldman as a woman of valor. So not the jewel in her husband's crown, but what have valor taken literally: brave, distinguished, change-making women who have been instrumental in making changes in the Jewish world and the broader world. profiling some of them, for example. So there are many, many examples here to look at. Some you may know, some you may not know. So that's fun to check out. And they really do a beautiful job at the JWA of trying to capture Jewish women's history. So when you ask, what is a modern Jewish woman? I don't know, like a lot of what's on this site would probably count. And also there's a very helpful timeline of Jewish feminism, which I wanted to flag for you as well. As I said, there was what we would consider feminist activity and really interesting Jewish women throughout Jewish history. Around the 60s, 70s is when we start seeing what we call Jewish feminism, essentially, right? And so we have examples here of Betty Friedan publishing The Feminine Mystique, Jane, the underground abortion service, etc. So this is, I think, a helpful timeline for tracing the impacts of Jewish feminism. And of course, if you click on any one of these, it will give you a lot of information about whatever it is that it's talking about. So national conference on Jewish women and men held in New York City. So thinking about these sorts of things, I love Lesbian Herstory Archives opens in 1976. So if you want to get a sense of Jewish feminist history, this is a really, really great resource. I'm just going to pause the share and see if anybody has any questions or anything you want to say right now. We'll have lots of time for questions and discussion after, but sometimes it's nice not to wait if something got flagged for you. Okay, I would love if we can make it a smidge interactive. If you feel like it, you don't have to. I would love to see you write in the chat around the age you were when you came into some kind of understanding of gender, feminism, this sort of thing, like I had with my aha moments, my wait a minute moments. So I was, 7, and then I was 14 really when I started to be like, 14 was when, it's like, oh, women are not treated fairly sometimes in Jewish spaces. So what was the age where you maybe had a bit of an aha moment? And that could be in any direction. I don't want to assume everybody here was raised female, so maybe you had a different kind of experience, but I'm just looking for a number of an age. Where would you guess you were like, oh, there's sexism in the tradition or in the world? Let's wait till I have a few numbers. So I'd say for me, that was around age 14. Really understanding sexism in the Jewish tradition. Okay, I've got 13, 16. I'd love just a couple other numbers if you can think of it. 10, 17, okay, 16. A lot of teens, 13. Yeah, I kind of expected to get a bunch of people say 12 or 13, partly because of the Bar Mitzvah rituals. That was another moment for me when I attended a lot of bar and bat mitzvahs when I was 12, 13 years old. And a lot of them were in communities where people were doing the same sort of thing, reading from the Torah, etc. But the Orthodox ones I went to, women were not reading from the Torah. So it was another moment for me where I was like, oh, there are different expectations. And someone said 30, so that's very interesting. Those who said something like 13, I just want to flag that there's a kind of sad tinge to that. It is the time of Jewish coming of age for those who are raised Jewish. And part, I think, of the coming of age for many of us has been these awakenings around gender and the barriers we may face in Jewish community. It's not a coming of age we often talk about, but I do think it's actually part of the coming of age for a lot of bar, bat, b'nai mitzvahs, is thinking about their own gender identity and how it fits with Jewish tradition. And of course, today I work with many bar mitzvahs who are non-binary or transitioning or have family members who have, etc. So I think thinking about gender through a Jewish frame is more commonly part of the bar mitzvah, but for a lot of that was our first encounters with sexism as well. Yeah, someone made a really interesting comment that they were older and it took a longer time to recognize sexism in a supposedly egalitarian reform experience. And I don't want to pick on the reform because I think that this is actually in many, many Jewish spaces and movements, even when they say they're egalitarian. First of all, I've often said, why do we use the word egalitarian? What does egalitarian mean? Just put in the chat or unmute. What does egalitarian mean? You've heard it 1,000 times in Jewish spaces. What does it mean? It's not a trick question. What does it mean to you? Comes kind of from the word equal. Yeah, everyone's the same, exactly. So this was an important move by Jewish feminists to say, like, we should all say the same prayers. Anyone can wear the kippah, choose, right? Anybody of any gender, etc. And I think a lot of people have had the experience of being like, okay, love that I can read from the Torah and wear a kippah, but how come it's only women in the kitchen doing the dishes after the Shabbat? You know, how come experiences like pregnancy and birth are not treated with the same kind of ritual and reverence as our other life cycle moments, right? And so egalitarian to me is not the same as feminist. So I've often said, do you mean egalitarian or do you mean feminist? Because I'm much more interested in a feminist Jewish space than an egalitarian Jewish space myself. Because I agree that sometimes when things are egalitarian, they're not really. Not to mention huge problems of, like, within Jewish communities and spaces, unequal power differentials, sometimes, unfortunately, harassment and abuse. So many of the problems that exist everywhere, of course, exist in our spaces. And it can feel especially painful if you've walked into a place hearing that it's egalitarian and that there will be no gender issues to discover that there are. So thank you for putting that into the room. I think that's very important. Okay. I will tell you one more story before I dive back into sharing some materials. It's so, of the moment, we are in the month of Adar. We're actually in the month of first Adar. Rosh Chodesh Adar 2 is Saturday, I want to say. I should know off the top of my head, but I don't. So the new month comes in on Rosh Chodesh, as was explained. And, excuse me, and this year is a Jewish leap year. It's also, and I'm sorry if this is repetitive to stuff you've already been talking about, but just so we all know, it was obviously also a leap year in our common calendar. We had February 29th last week, but it's a Jewish leap year, and in a Jewish leap year, according to the Hebrew calendar, we actually get a whole extra month, not just a day, and it is this month, the month of Adar. So we are in Adar 1, and then Rosh Chodesh will come, and then we will be in Adar 2. And so we get 2 times the month of Adar this year, and in any Jewish leap year, which means 2 Purim celebrations. We had Purim Katan, the smaller version, last week, and in the month of Adar 2 is the kind of more recognized Purim celebration as we typically do it. So I will tell you a Purim story. And again, I'm not trying to, all my stories are from the Lubavitchers because that's where I would hang out. I'm sure there were problems in other places. But this time I was about 16. So I've already done the New York trip. And the reason this happened is I had a very, very good friend who was Chabad Lubavitch, and for sure, part of his goal was trying to make me turn into a Lubavitcher, but we were also genuinely friends. We went to high school together, and I went to his place for Shabbat dinner many, many Shabbats, and I loved it so much, and we had amazing conversation and text study and debate. It was exactly what I think a Shabbat dinner should be, so I really, really value that. And he invited me to a Chabad Lubavitch Purim celebration, where you may know it is traditional to drink alcohol on Purim. I was surprised as a 16-year-old that they were very happy to give me alcohol. Like, they were not legal. But I did say yes. But also the drinking was excessive, which is actually what you're supposed to do. But it was, notable for me. I'd never really seen people drinking in public that way. And of course, because it was Chabad, there was a mechitza, there was a men's side and a women's side. So first there was a kind of like light snack sort of dinner. Everybody was seated at tables, and then dancing started. And, a Purim celebration in the Chabad community is amazing, so joyful and so raucous, but lots and lots of alcohol. And then a man from the men's side of the mechitza drank too much and was going to be sick, and he leaned over the mechitza to throw up on the women's side. can you, I was like, okay. I was like 3 strikes, I'm never coming back to a place like this. So okay, he was very drunk. Maybe it wasn't intentional, but maybe it was intentional, and there was some disrespect there in my interpretation of it. I'm just wanting to note another comment in the chat. I was in New York when Jewish feminism was beginning and flourishing. So cool. I interviewed members of the Minyan community. I was told that the value of participation of what was of interest more than egalitarian perspective. So cool. So I love hearing these diverse experiences. And I'll just continue on kind of my own feminist awakening. I discovered not long after that the poet Adrienne Rich, who many of you may know, lesbian feminist poet. And oh, actually, I'm not gonna read this whole poem because it's very long, but when I read the poem Yom Kippur 1984, it was a feminist awakening. It was a Jewish awakening. I really think it's part of why I wanted to become a rabbi. This poem, I would think I was about 16 when I read this. Just a life-changing experience. So I'll pop it into the chat. As I said, it is a very long poem. So just for the sake of time, I'm not going to read the whole of it, but we'll start it together. Okay. And so she's obviously referring to Yom Kippur. She draws from Leviticus and then writes, "What is a Jew in solitude? What would it mean not to feel lonely or afraid, far from your own or those you have called your own? What is a woman in solitude, a queer woman or man, in the empty street, on the empty beach, in the desert? What in this world, as it is, can solitude mean?" And then it just goes on. There's some hard moments of this poem, some violent moments, but also incredible, breathtaking beauty. And this is her kind of reckoning as her Yom Kippur practice, walking and thinking and writing, but really thinking about what it means that Jews and women, and of course Jewish women, have been so often on the margins of their communities. And that, to me, it was so beautiful and just such a wake-up call. And so I attribute some of my Jewish feminism to her as well. So if you don't know that poem, I hope you will look at it. And then I wanted to just do a couple of other things. Sorry, I'm bouncing around. I hope I'm not making anybody dizzy. A couple of other things to talk about, and then I wanted to transition more to the kind of modern question. So thinking about those who changed and challenged liturgy, I really love the liturgy of Marsha Falk. This is her Book of Blessings. So similarly to what we saw from those Ashkenazi Yiddish women's poems and the Judith Plaskow, she's really writing new liturgy for Jews to make it more egalitarian, to make it more focused on the concerns of women. And I particularly love her blessing for children that we do on Shabbat. And there are Hebrew versions. They are gendered for male, female, but the English isn't. And it simply says, "Be who you are, and may you be blessed in all that you are." Isn't that a lovely blessing to say to a child on Shabbat? So this is another beautiful resource that's called the Book of Blessings. And then the last thing, which I'll point to, which I'm sure many of you have read, is The Red Tent, this novel, which is Midrash, which is a reimagining of the Dinah story in the Bible, but really calls on Jewish feminist tradition and is very well researched. So it picks up on the story of Dinah, but also the story, for example, of Rachel, who, when she leaves her father's house in anger, steals his teraphim, his kind of, I don't know, you would say idols or statuettes or representations of other gods. And like, what does that mean? Which is so interesting that story gets left in the Bible. I love that appears. And then there's this whole thing in the book, this isn't a major spoiler, where there's like period blood and these teraphim, and it's thinking about kind of holiness and all these really interesting ways. So I was really inspired by this when I first read it. I also have come back to it more recently as a birth worker, because there's so much about birth in this book. So this is my own particular interest. But here we are. There's a lot of discussion of birth. There are important midwives in the story, and of course there are important midwives in the story of the Exodus, which many of us know, at Moses' birth, his midwives Shiphrah and Puah are named, which is quite astonishing. And in it, it says the midwife has this kind of refrain for somebody in labor. She says, "Fear not, the time is coming. Fear not, your bones are strong. Fear not, help is nearby," etc., etc. "Fear not, we have water and salt. Fear not, little mother. Fear not, mother of us all." And I want, first of all, you can absolutely be a Jewish woman and not be a mother, right? Not required. Um, Motherhood is complex in the Jewish tradition. There's so many stereotypes of what it means to be a Jewish mother. That's like a whole other talk. I went to a great conference paper presentation about the stereotype of the Jewish mother, and she showed all of these clips from film and television about different Jewish mothers. You can imagine the kinds of things. But also this idea that mothers birth the nation, which is an incredible honor and gift, and also an incredible responsibility, and the reason for so much repression of women, actually, right? And so it's this double-edged thing that I think contemporary Jewish feminists wish to reclaim. So again, you could be a woman giving birth, you could be a trans person giving birth, but this idea of each time you give birth to a Jew, and in Judaism traditionally and according to Jewish law, the line goes through the maternal line. So, if you were born to a Jewish mother, you yourself are Jewish, whether or not she practices or regardless of anything else. So there's this idea that every time you give birth, you are also giving birth to the nation, which I find very compelling as somebody who got really interested in birth traditions. That might not be your jam. Lots of ways into Jewish feminism, and in a sense, I think they're absolutely part of the same conversation. There's a real movement spearheaded by the National Council of Jewish Women called Rabbis for Repro, or Jews for Abortion Access. They're related campaigns. This has been going on for many years, but the idea is that there are many, many reasons why access to safe and legal abortion is reflective of Jewish teachings and Jewish values. And so, we are living in a time where Roe v. Wade was overturned, where we're seeing in many states in the United States abortion bans or extreme restrictions, but let's not think we're so different here in Canada. There are many places in this country where it is extremely difficult to access abortion. So even if it's legal, that doesn't mean it's possible for everybody to get one. So I think this is very important advocacy work that gets done. So this is an example of, what's going on with contemporary Jewish feminism, what's going on for a lot of the concerns of Jewish women and many others who are fighting for reproductive rights and access here as well. And so that's an example. I think, the whole world, and you probably heard, I think last week, there was a ruling that even an embryo created through in vitro fertilization counts as a human life. And so this is having widespread implications on not only people seeking abortion, but also even people seeking fertility treatment. These are women's issues, not only women, but absolutely. I think if we care about Jewish women and Jewish feminists, these are our shared concerns. So lots of ways to get involved with this kind of stuff. Okay, and then the same author, oh, sorry, I didn't close my annoying cookies pop up, which is always hard to do when you're in screen share. Okay. So Anita Dimon, who wrote The Red Tent, has other books, but this is her most recent, I believe, and it's called Period, End of Sentence, A New Chapter in the Fight for Menstrual Justice. So remember I talked about how I went to the mikveh when I was young and they said women are unclean, and really I believe there was like a real misogyny to how that was explained to me. That doesn't mean that's the way all Orthodox people interpret it, but the way it was taught to me. So this is a kind of reclamation of periods of menstrual justice. I know a lot of Jewish communities participate in things like period purses and period projects where you collect menstrual products for people who are unhoused or anywhere really. It's always notable to me that we live in a society where we agree we shouldn't all have to carry our own toilet paper, and you can go to any public bathroom and expect to find toilet paper, but not menstrual products. So why? What's the difference? The difference is that not everybody has a period, and often the people who don't are the decision makers. So I think there's interesting work to be done here as well. And then, because I mentioned, oh, sorry, I don't want that. Just a second. I did want to flag that there's some beautiful things going on with mikvah, the ritual bath. So as much as I was kind of turned off the idea of mikvah because of the way it was explained to me, I've really come around. And why? Actually, I think it's notable to say, I'm going to give a little content warning. If you want to step away, I'm going to talk just for a moment about pregnancy loss. When I myself experienced pregnancy loss, I really was yearning for a traditional way to mark that. And it led me to mikvah. So even though I had rejected it as a young feminist, I was like, surely there are better ways. And there were. And I've had beautiful mikvah experiences. So this is an example from Boston, Mayim Chaim, which means living waters. Really beautiful. And I want to give credit to where credit's due. Another Toronto rabbi, Rabbi Elise Goldstein, wrote a piece called Let's Take Back the Waters, or maybe just Take Back the Waters, where she talks about how the mikvah should be a place of learning, of study, of community, of discussion. It should be vibrant, and a place where women go to connect with each other. And that has been created at Mayim Chaim. In New York, there's a beautiful one called Immerse NYC, but many local mikvah opportunities exist for people seeking alternative ways to connect with this tradition. You can also absolutely do this on your own. My very first mikvah ceremony was actually the day of my wedding, and we did it in Lake Ontario. All of the women closest to me gathered on the beach. We had a little ceremony, and then we all went in the lake. So it can be in a formal mikvah or not, but just to say that a lot of what contemporary Jewish women and others, mikvah isn't actually specifically gendered, but it does often come from not many reasons people go to mikvah. Sometimes at Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, sometimes if you've experienced a loss or a change and you want to mark it, but it has been historically also linked to after a menstrual period. And so that's why women who are halachically practicing go every month. So there are interesting ways to reclaim that tradition if you want to. And I do want to say, when I read The Red Tent, which is centered on the premise that women would be told to leave the community essentially and live in a kind of exile with each other during the time of menstruation, that's sexist and also scientifically weird. Like, nothing bad is going to happen to you if you touch a woman who's menstruating. But also, there was part of me that was like, could we get that now? If there was a red tent and I could go hang out with a bunch of women and not have to work for a few days every month, like, I would sign up for that. So I do think that there are things to think about in terms of our tradition and, what fits and what doesn't fit, etc. I want to flag interesting work going on as well. This is a book called Between Rights and Rights, spelled the two ways. Excision in Women's Experiential Text and Human Context. So this is about that kind of separation from the community and what has meant, how a lot of women's RITES rights, women's rituals have been sometimes coming from sexist tradition, but also incredibly powerful, like the Rosh Chodesh ones. And what that all has to do with women's rights, RIGHTS. And then wanted to also flag this book called Yentl's Revenge by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who many of you may know. She's a lovely, prominent, brilliant rabbi. But this one is called The Next Wave of Jewish Feminism. Yentl's Revenge, The Next Wave of Jewish Feminism. So if you're looking for more texts to think about what is the modern Jewish woman, what is modern feminism, these are some of the ones I would point to. And then I want to talk a bit about Rosh Chodesh. This is what we're here to do. So I'll paste this into chat. You may have covered this at a different time, so I'm sorry if it's repetition. But the way Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, becomes a women's holiday is it's sort of like a reward because it is said, and this is just in last week's Torah portion, so the timing of this is perfect because last week we talk about the golden calf, and the Midrash suggests that women didn't participate in the building of the golden calf, only men did. And so the reward for these kind of good women, these obedient good women, is that we get the new moon holiday. I think it's also fair to say that it's likely tied to the menstrual cycle, that the new moon comes around every 28 days, and so do many menstrual cycles. So there's that kind of embodied link. And for that reason, I think Rosh Chodesh invites us into thinking about embodied practice. So there are many places where you can find red tent circles or Rosh Chodesh circles. I should have I'll just pull it up now. If you're interested in that, the group at the Well encourages people to create Rosh Chodesh circles and gives lots and lots of material for marking Rosh Chodesh. So because the month of Adar is supposed to be a month of welcoming joy, this month they have all of these practices for welcoming joy, but also redefining joy in a difficult time. So if you're interested in connecting with them, and then every month they put out a moon manual. So as I mentioned, it's almost Adar 2. So they have a manual for that. And then of course, for every Hebrew month, there's a different manual drawing on the themes traditionally of that month. And so this is a cool thing to connect with if that's interesting to you. And then I want to just talk a little bit about Kohenets. So people may know about them, but they may not. This is Beit Kohenet, which is, I'm not affiliated with, but Kohenets are Hebrew priestesses. And so they are really interested in embodied going, uncovering feminine spiritualities in Jewish tradition, redefining or reclaiming ritual that focused on the divine feminine, the sacred feminine within us all, etc. They do have monthly circles for Rosh Chodesh, as mentioned, but often very focused on a kind of embodied, creative, spiritual practice. So I see this as a very feminist expression of Jewish life. It's not for everybody. It can be a little bit woo, but I will just share with you that a Kohenet whom I really like, Katsira Lesser, created these tarot cards. Tarot may not be for everybody, and I'm like a very secular person, but nevertheless I really like, at Rosh Chodesh, my practice is to pull some tarot cards. This is going to be very hard to show on the Zoom screen, but they're beautiful. Her art is gorgeous, and she based them on the female or feminine archetypes that Kohenets draw on. So this is the companion book. So they are Nara for maiden, Ohevet for lover, Ima for mother, Gvira for queen, matriarch or warrior, Hahama for the wise woman, Mealedet for midwife, Mekonenet for mourning woman, Mourning, Doreshet for seeker, Sova for shrine keeper, Neviah for prophetess, Baalat O for shamaness, witch or spirit vessel, Leitzanit for sacred fool, and Oreget for weaver. And so you pull these cards, and they're beautiful images corresponding to all of those archetypes, and they're all kind of feminine, centering the sacred feminine. So I feel like that's a lovely practice on a traditional women's holiday like Rosh Chodesh. And then I wanted to just show you, I'm mindful of time and I want lots of time for us to discuss if we wish, but this is a Zoom presentation I've put together in previous years leading up to Passover, so it's a little early for our purposes. I may run something, I haven't decided yet what I always do some kind of webinar before Passover, and sometimes it's this one and sometimes it's others, so I'm still playing. But just to say, there are many traditions of feminism you could bring into a feminist Seder. So thinking about freedom and oppression, it may call us to think about feminism in an intersectional lens and what it may be. And this I took from another kind of early work of Jewish feminism called Deborah, Golda, and Me by Letty Cotton Pogrebin. And she writes about a feminist Seder they attended. And it was just about changing some of the rituals. So you may know at a Passover Seder, it's traditional to wash your hands twice. And they created a ritual where they had like if you can imagine, a pitcher and a bowl, and they passed it around the table, and each woman would wash the hands of the woman on her left, for example. I can't remember if it was left or right. And then they went around. So the hand washing became an act of caretaking and, calling each other into community in a different way. Sharing leadership. So very often at a Passover Seder, it has historically been men leading the Seder, and it's like one main voice leading the Seder. What if we diversify the voices at the table? Many people do this, etc. So, and then I'll just show this slide. This is a way you could represent the Passover story, this image of Moses talking to Pharaoh. Or this is a way you could represent the Passover story of Miriam leading the women in song. So, who do we focus on? Do we focus on Shifra and Puah, the midwives, Yocheved, Moses' mother, Miriam? Or do we focus mostly on Moses and Pharaoh? And, I think there are different ways of telling the sacred story, which is a reminder that there are ways to do Jewish feminism in everything we do. So I did want to just, I'll share with you my two websites. This is Jewish Doula, and if you're interested, this was just kind of how I became interested in Jewish birth. And really, you can read it in my doula story, but I'll give you the Coles Notes version. By the way, this is my daughter at her first graduation ceremony of many, I hope. But I was in labor. It wasn't going great. And I was like seeking, I was like, what are the Jewish blessings? What are the rituals? What do people do in this moment? And I didn't know. And I was a rabbi. It's like, why the hell did no one teach me? Right. And that's when I started looking at the Yiddish women's prayers. And that's when I started doing research. There's so much out there on Jewish birth traditions that has been very much hidden from mainstream Judaism. And so I wanted to kind of reclaim it. Interestingly, Orthodox Jewish women almost always have a doula because of what I perceive as the sexist laws of Nida, where if there's any kind of blood, then her husband can't touch her. So there's a tradition of female birth workers. So I don't love the origin, but I love that there are these birth traditions that are passed down generationally, like in the book, The Red Tent. But so many of us who aren't Orthodox don't access that. We don't even know it exists to ask for it, right? And so I wanted to create an option for women who aren't necessarily Orthodox, but who want to tap into that Jewish wisdom for pregnancy, labor, and birth. So always happy to connect about that. And then lastly, yes, I run a community called Secular Synagogue. So I was ordained by the secular humanistic Jewish movement. And if you don't know what that is, that's okay. But essentially, we do cultural Judaism, Jewish holiday celebrations, learning programs, text study, basically what you've seen me do tonight, everything Jewish from a kind of secular, culturally Jewish perspective. So if you're interested in finding out more about us, then get on our email list. We have a couple of events coming up that are open to everybody. And yeah, we would love to have you connect with us. Okay. Whew, so much talking for me. I would love to hear questions, other experiences you want to share. The floor is yours. Okay, the name of now I have too many books. Hold on, I have to dig it out. Oh no, everything's falling. I have a very small desk, so when I make a mess like this, it's like impossible. Okay, it's simply called A Book of. There's like a sticker that annoying me. A Book of Jewish Women's Prayers, selected and with commentary by Norman Tarner. I'll just type the name in the chat. A Book of Jewish Women's Prayers. There are others. There are many collections. This is the one I have. Any other questions? I don't want to keep you here if I'm between like you and dinner or whatever. Yeah,
I'll
just
go.
go for
I'll
it.
bring something up.
Love it.
Actually, I was really looking forward to discussing this topic because as whatever the definition we want to give to a modern Jewish woman is, one thing I really appreciate about you is, you're open to, there's no one definition of what being a Jewish woman means. So a lot of the things that you talked about really resonated with me, such as, the first story that you talked about and that difference in gender roles. And I'm curious to know if you've had any other Jewish women or men or that have said to you that they've felt different in some way, or not turned off, but had different thoughts around being Jewish and having these gender roles, and curious to know your thoughts around that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, look, I think there are many ways into Jewish life and different things work for different people. So I've certainly heard women who are Orthodox talk about that they value that there are different gender roles, especially if there's a really wide spectrum of what that looks like. So some people don't have a lot of power, but if you're an Orthodox Jewish woman and you've, got lots of power in your relationship and your family and you can kind of study and do whatever you want, um, some of them will say, I really do appreciate that there are separate roles, that they're both considered holy, that everybody has a contribution to make. And then there are women who are more like me who don't want to be constricted with roles that are given to me by a tradition or by somebody else. That I feel like we have to choose our own way, and part of what I believe feminism is for is to empower us with greater choices. So whether that's to become a parent or not become a parent, whether that's to work exclusively in the home or outside the home, whether that's to have a deep relationship with Jewish text and study and make that a focal point of your life. We're like, not at all, right? I think all of these are great ways to be Jewish women. So, circling back to the idea of the Eshet Hayil, the woman of valor, to me, the woman of valor is the woman who's true to her own values and self, right? And of course, that's different for all of us. But that's what I think, what my interpretation of our tradition is saying. You have to determine, this isn't specifically gendered. Each of us, any gender, must determine what we are here to do, what are our gifts, what is the contribution we can make, who do we want to be, and so to me, because it is part of my identity that I'm a woman, I think showing up for other women, challenging patriarchal constrictions in our tradition, modeling what it means to be a woman in leadership in Judaism. These things are important, reclaiming birth traditions and other things that have been suppressed. That's part of it for me, but that doesn't mean that has to be that exact thing is not what we're, I think each of us has to figure out what our thing is. I do like that once when my kids were much younger, my daughter once asked, Mommy, are all women rabbis? And I was like, do you mean are all rabbis women? And she was like, no, like she just thought like you become a woman and you're automatically a rabbi, which is like a amazing kind of. But I didn't grow up with that many examples of women who could be rabbis. There were some. Now it's not even a question, some of the most prominent rabbis in Jewish life are women. And so I feel like these are beautiful gains, and there's lots to do because, as people were mentioning, sometimes we step into a space expecting there to be no problem in terms of gender, and the problems still persist. And so I see that as all of our work. But yeah, in terms of what it means to be a modern Jewish woman, I think that's going to be very individual. I had a question in the chat, a very interesting question. Please talk about how you feel about women-only experiences, pros and cons, and how does the recent openness to non-binary people affect this? Okay, so I think, how do I want to answer it? I think that there have been some spaces that have previously been women only that are very enriched by openness to trans and non-binary people. There's so you can think of it as, somebody told it to me, this is, I hope it's a little glib, but I like it, it's easy to remember, ABCD, anyone but cis dudes, like one way to think of it. So there's some spaces like that. And I actually still think it's valuable to have women only spaces. I think the challenge is when, for example, like if it's a Rosh Chodesh circle and there's no option for a non-binary person to participate. So I would love to see women only spaces, trans and non-binary only spaces. You can even have a trans masculine or trans feminine only space. I would love to see men's spaces where they do really interesting work on gender. So I think the problem is a scarcity of these kinds of spaces. And so when there's a scarcity, of course, it feels, and it is an injustice if certain people are left out. But if we can create multiple and many spaces where there's a space for everybody, then I think it's wonderful to connect with women. I mean, to me, that's absolutely inclusive of anyone who identifies as a woman, regardless of their assigned sex at birth. But I think women only spaces absolutely still have a place and have value. And I think that all people deserve a space where they feel their own sense of belonging.
I was going to say, sorry, I guess I'll hijack again. You made a comment that I really appreciated, which was, whether you want to have children or not. And I don't know if anyone else can relate, but depending on what your family may be like and its traditions, in Judaism, we place an emphasis on having children, being fruitful and multiplying, right? And the modern Jewish woman for me means we can give Judaism a different definition. It doesn't make you less Jewish to not have kids, right? So I also appreciate being able to feel that sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's important. I tried to allude to that when I said, I think the power to give birth and birth not only your own child but be part of birthing the nation is hugely powerful, but it has also been the site of a lot of oppression of women, right, where then we're seen as baby makers. And there's lots about this. There's a whole, I didn't really speak about it because I don't know everybody well, but when there was the Me Too movement, there was a corresponding one. It was like hashtag Gam Ani, which means Me Too in Hebrew, talking about sexual harassment and violence in Jewish spaces. Unfortunately, many examples. And one of the people who was really discredited was a Jewish sociologist. And so there's been really interesting work on how much of the conversation we've all heard about Jewish continuity, these sorts of things, is actually figuring that women have to be baby makers, like as our Jewish responsibility. And how sexist is that really? And then we find out that person's also an abuser. Well, if you don't see women as wholly human and able to make these choices, perhaps it's not so hard to imagine that there are all kinds of problems with power. And so, I've seen things targeting women in rabbinical school. It says, become an ima, the bima can wait. So like become a mother first, lots of time to become a rabbi. Why? Because actually it takes a long time to become a rabbi and establish your practice and find your community. And by the time some people get there, they're sort of past their most fertile window. And so instead of Jewish tradition saying like, so glad you're on the bima, we need dynamic Jewish leadership, they're like, have kids first. That's the priority because you're a woman and that's how we see you, right? So I am a mother, and I got to choose when to become a mother, which I don't take lightly. But that was my choice. And if I didn't want to be a mother, I absolutely think that would make me no less a Jew, no less a woman. Randy, go for it.
Thank you. I don't have the ability to unmute, I guess. Someone doesn't want me to talk. So just further to what you just said, I'm just wondering how infertility plays into all this, because I know in Judaism, it's so, it's so important to procreate, have children, have, the continuity of the family, etc. But there's so many women out there who are struggling with infertility, or couples that struggle with infertility. And I know that Chabad has been instrumental in a lot of communities in funding things like IVF. So I'm just wondering, like in general, like if that's changing over time, and is it more acceptable? And because a lot of those women feel so lonely and isolated because they can't conceive. So what's your take on
Yeah.
that?
I mean, I think infertility is hugely painful and difficult for so many people. I certainly don't think it helps if you belong to a community where you are constantly being asked, like, where's the baby? So I think there's a role for us to play in, none of us should be asking, this is not just Jewish, this is everywhere. But, in our Jewish spaces, I'll just center there. No one should be asked, where's the baby? Are you trying? Like, these are deeply personal questions. And it should just be understood. It's kind of off the table that if somebody wants to share something about their fertility journey, they will, but that's not really for people to ask. And certainly this pressure on women to have babies as like a Jewish responsibility, that has to go as a concept in my view. So infertility in Judaism is very interesting because of, I mentioned the laws of Niddah. And so there's a certain, after menstruation, there's a certain number of days that you're supposed to count. You go to the mikvah, all these things. And unfortunately, sometimes the rabbinic tradition did not understand science the way we might now. And so for some people who had a shorter menstrual cycle, so let's say a typical cycle is 28 days, but a menstrual cycle can vary. So some people have a short cycle, some people have a long cycle. And if you're somebody with a shorter cycle, for some, all those days you're supposed to count actually got them out of their fertility window. And so they were not even necessarily infertile. They were just not able to get pregnant when they could get pregnant, if that makes sense. So I think there have been a lot of discussion. This obviously only applies to people who are following those laws, which is only in very Orthodox communities. So that doesn't apply to everybody, but there have been interesting conversations about like, okay, we should not, if somebody's experiencing fertility, maybe the first thing to try is timing, and then of course there are contemporary fertility measures. So yes, there are some communities that will fund IVF. Look, I think IVF should just be covered under pharmacare. I think it's important healthcare for anybody, obviously not just for Jews. I love that IVF is being covered by community in some cases. I don't love that they won't fund
Oh, you're frozen. You're frozen.
IVF for queer in touch with anyway. So
I missed
yeah.
that. You froze. Did anyone
So
hear that? You froze there for a second. Oh.
sorry. I just got that your connection is unstable message. Sorry about that. So what I was saying is a lot of those agencies come from the Orthodox world and they will fund IVF, but not for queer couples, not for intermarried couples. So look, on the one hand, their argument is this is our money, this is our prerogative, this is how we understand Jewish law, and we are looking to create babies who will be faithful to Jewish tradition. And that is perhaps they're right. For me, it's unfair. And if we're going to fund some Jewish people having fertility treatments, then it would be better to fund anybody who wants it. So that's something that I would love to see in the more liberal Jewish world. But it's, fertility treatments are extremely expensive. So there are many, many challenges here. But just to say that, it's one of those, like as a rabbi who offers pastoral care to people in difficult times around death, the grieving, etc., infertility is really up there. Some of the hardest experiences people go through. I shared my own experience with pregnancy loss. I would love for us to be talking about these things in Jewish spaces. They're so very common, and yet because there's so much silence around these issues, it can feel very isolating. And I think there's work to do there. You know, if we could really just talk about all these things we're talking about tonight: menstruation, fertility, you know, pregnancy, infertility, birth, all of these things that are left out of the Beit Midrash and the prayer space, the Beit Knesset for so long. They should be in there. We should be having these conversations. That's why I tend to talk about my own pregnancy loss quite a lot, because I think it's important for other people to hear. And I think it's important that we are constantly affirming this is nothing to be ashamed of. It's actually extremely common. It's very painful. It's very common. And some of this is absolutely part of the women's experiences that we may be hoping to make more central in Jewish life.
Yes, thank you. And I know this is a whole other topic, which I don't want to go off on a tangent, but what about surrogacy? Like, is that something that's maybe more acceptable in Judaism nowadays?
I think all of this is pretty acceptable in Judaism, because I think the focus is like more Jewish babies. I know there are real I mean, also the laws are very strict around Canada, which is where we all are. It's easier in other places. I know there have been a lot of unfortunate, and honestly, I find very engaging things happening to people around surgery, and whether the egg comes from a Jewish woman or whether the carrier comes from a Jewish woman, and what makes that baby Jewish. And like, oh my God, let these people just have a Jewish baby. Like, let's not read so much about it. So there are challenges, but I'm not an expert on this, but as far as I'm aware, there aren't really rules against fertility or surrogacy or anything like this in Jewish communities. And then I got a follow up to that previous question about women only spaces. What makes women only spaces valuable? Okay, so look, it's not valuable for everybody. Some people have no interest, right? But as I mentioned, with the idea of the intent, for me, the value comes from why sometimes it's valuable to have a Jewish only space. That when you're part of a group that has not been central, it is nice sometimes to connect with people experience. So I love that we can talk about things like menstruation and infertility and birth in all kinds of Jewish spaces. And that hasn't historically been how it is, you know? And so the value of women's only spaces have been to talk about some of those, you know, like I showed you many examples: writing blessings, having a community of people who understand your life experience, especially if you're not really encouraged to talk about it in more mainstream places. So I mean, maybe there won't always be a place for women only spaces. I don't know. Like I said, I think for me now, kind of where I'm at, I'm interested in spaces for people of marginalized genders, not just women necessarily, but I do still feel the impact of sexism in my own life. And it's nice to have a place to talk about that with people who experience it similarly, and to talk about it in places where there are good allies. And you know, I think it's not one or the other.
Hi, Rabbi. I have a question for you. Right now, I'm working with a lot of Jewish women and men, but primarily Jewish women who are struggling to feel safe in their identity as a Jewish person. Safe mostly in public spaces, but even just like in workspaces and school, amongst people who are not Jewish. And so what is my question? I guess, do you have any advice? Do you have any input on this? I know that like as Jewish people, we've, you know, in having to hide our identity in the past, it's been creates a lot of trauma. I mean, with anyone hiding their identity. So yeah, what kind of advice do you have in terms of how to feel confident, how to feel safe in who you are, in your traditions, in your values, in a world that is pretty divisive right now?
Yeah, that's easy question to answer. You know, I think we are living in a really challenging time for many reasons. So I appreciate that question. Look, and different people live in different places. So I do think that this has to be about prioritizing our own safety. There may be places where I don't want to be so out as a Jewish person. You know, I'm pretty lucky in most of my life. You know, I am out as a Jewish person. You know, I'm very Jewish on the internet and in all of the places where I work. And I've had good experiences almost entirely. So, how do I want to say it? Anti-Semitism is real. Its expression is on the rise. There's no question. Of course, we're fearful. It's very difficult, and many of us live with intergenerational trauma, right? And so all of that is here at play. And I believe that this is not the same as, you know, 1930s Germany, that we have many allies. You know, I believe most people are good and don't want to hold hate in their hearts. And so how do we hold these truths, you know, and how do we be who we are? Remember that blessing from Rosh Hashanah, the Shabbat children's blessing I love, says, be who you are and may you be all that you are. That doesn't mean it's easy. I think in all things, actually being fully who we are is very hard. We live in a world where we're really taught to fit in and conform, etc. And so if you're really going to stand out there and be who you are, that requires incredible, I think, spiritual fortitude and work. So for many people, that right now is being Jewish. How do I connect with a sense of pride in who I am in Jewish culture and identity at a time when I feel vulnerable externally, and also for a lot of people wrestling with it internally? These are very real questions. I got to answer for each individual. I mean, I would say, like, if you perceive your physical safety is threatened, do everything you can to make yourself safe, you know? But if this is just about fearing a kind of general anti-Semitism, I will say, look, you know, we all have to make our choices. But for me, I think part of it is that when people know Jews, they're less likely to hate the Jews, you know? And so if we can be the awesome, intelligent, interesting, fun, curious, giving, loving people we are, and tell the world we are all those things as Jews, then that's how we do it, you know? And so, that might be only a partial answer to your question. There's lots of to do on combating anti-Semitism, but I think be who you are and may you be all that you are is one way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Thank you.
Welcome.
Do we have any other questions? Anything else that we'd like to ask Rabbi Denise or just bring into the discussion? Okay. Well, on behalf of JCFS, I would like to thank everybody for attending tonight's workshop, The Modern Jewish Woman, Who Is She? I hope that we all were able to gain our own definition of what it means to be a Jewish woman. Additionally, I'd like to thank you, Rabbi Denise. As always, you did wonderful, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you again. And last but not least, the Jewish Foundation and the Rosh Chodesh team for helping us put this together. I just want to bring everyone's attention to another workshop that we have coming up on April 2nd at 7 p.m. at the Bernie Theater at the Asper campus. We are showing a film called Making Trouble, 3 Generations of Jewish Women. It's a film production by the Jewish Women's Archive, and it's all about Jewish women and humor and continuing on with that theme. So hopefully we see you guys there. Registration will be coming up very soon. And thanks again.
Thanks all. Great to connect with you. Take good care.
Thanks so much.